This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined, as always, by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for promoting the Patreon at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good morning, folks. I am dosed up on chocolate Easter eggs and ready to talk all things EVs and gas. But before we do that, good folks, anyone who hasn't head on over to our Patreon for a gander should do that, because, I can't promise it's better than a giant chocolate bunny, but I also wouldn't be floating that if I didn't think it was a pretty good chance.
Well, we're also joined by a man of the people, equally comfortable striding the halls of gaming conventions as he is wandering around the UNFCCC conference of parties. Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
There's a lot of similarities between the two, many overly complicated tables of data in both, and an awful lot of role-playing. I was at a role-playing games convention just over this past long weekend, playing 9 hours worth of collective games spanning the full spectrum from ridiculous fantasy dungeon crawls to ridiculous gender-diverse pirates having romantic entanglements in a dysfunctional ship. So, it takes all sorts.
Perfect preparation for discussing the GSOO, which is indeed what we're discussing on this week's show as we interrogate the opportunities laid out in AEMO's gas statement of opportunities. But first, we have some follow-up. Just 3 episodes ago, we dug into the detail of the Albanese government's consultation paper on Australia's new vehicle efficiency standard. And since then, it has been on like Donkey Kong, with many of the key players mired in fierce and sometimes febrile debate about what this regulation would mean for the costs and availability of some of Australia's most beloved vehicles. However, comity and fellow feeling have now been restored after Chris Bowen and Catherine King announced a revised proposal that dropped the ambition a bit, but managed to get all the big stakeholders back in the tent. Frankie, did the government fold under pressure, or was their initial position an ambit claim all along?
I think it's probably fair to say that, and I think most people who are good negotiators go into negotiations having perhaps started with something either a little bit more ambitious than they thought they might end up with, or willing to give some ground. If I think back to the episode we did on the standards paper as it was out there, I think we'd all agreed that they had gone pretty bold on a few elements of the standard, like classifying, SUVs and four-wheel drives as passenger vehicles, which was more ambitious than what had happened over in the US. And, I think it's probably unsurprising that that's where some of the compromise has been given. To me, that was one of the biggest concessions, if you like, out of the negotiations with the various industry types. So where we've landed, apart from now, instead of having, all the SUVs and four-wheel drives classed as passenger vehicles and subject to, stricter emission standards that ramp down more quickly, a lot of the big ones like your Land Cruisers, your Ford Everests, Nissan Patrols and Pajero Sports are now classed in the light commercial category. The rationale for that I thought was a bit funny. It was something around I think you just come up with the excuse you need to make that make sense.
And rules that limit the scope of that concession a bit, and more than 3.5 tons of towing capacity.
Yeah, they were talking about the size and weight of the chassis and things like that. So, okay, so that's happened. I think also the trajectory on the emissions caps have been eased a little bit to the end of the decade, and they also introduced some crediting arrangements as well. So, companies whose averages across their fleet come in below the cap will get the credits that can be traded with other manufacturers. So that sounds like a bit of pooling enabled as well. So yeah, I guess so yes, I think we could probably say a version of this was always going to happen. I don't think you start off with the exact bit of legislation you expect to pass through both the House and Senate before negotiations with the industry affected. So the work really remains now how this gets through the Parliament, right?
And there's a view from the federal opposition that they will not support anything that requires one group of drivers to subsidise the choices of others. I don't quite understand that as a I'm not sure that's the full position that is taken across all areas of policy. But anyway, they're not in it to negotiate. So the government's got to deal with the Greens and get a couple of crossbench senators. And I think they're very likely to get them. A question that could be asked by people who are maybe sometimes a little dissatisfied with the kind of centrist viewpoint that we have been known to take from time to time is, well, why was the government negotiating with industry at all? Industry doesn't have votes in the Parliament. The coalition's not up for anything and will criticise anything. So why didn't the government say, Michael Corleone in Godfather Part 2 style, here's my offer to you, nothing. And just do what they thought was best, or do what they thought would get the Greens on board. And I guess the most plausible to me answer to that is that, yes, given the political strategies around, the standards of this sort will always be criticised from a this is the end of the weekend point of view. But the strength of the rules, or the feasibility of the rules, does actually have an impact on how persuasive that criticism will be. And if you can get vehicle suppliers to broadly cohere into a we can live with this viewpoint, that is helpful from the point of view of getting rules to be seen as workable and not a major area of weakness, even if they are subject to pro forma attacks.
And durable, right? In a situation where you don't have bipartisan support, if you've got industry coalescing around a set of rules, it does make it much more likely in the event of a change of government that those rules will endure once they're in place. And so from a durability perspective, I think it's important. I said in my introduction that they reduced the ambition a bit. And I think that's the thing to keep an eye on, right? Like, this isn't some massive rolling back. It is something much, much weaker. As I understand it, the emissions reduction trajectory for passenger vehicles, noting that there's been changes of categorisation, but putting that aside for a moment, passenger vehicles emissions reduction trajectory is still around 60% over 5 years, and it's reduced from 60% to 50% for light commercial vehicles. And so this is still fairly ambitious policy, especially considering the baseline is nothing.
Yes. So I think that's right. And in my dodgy spreadsheet, the existing most popular models in the country, if you set them against 2028 or 2029 fleet emissions limit curves, they're all way above the limit, and so massive change in the makeup of new vehicle sales is still required. I do think that there is some room for worry about, or just more analysis to reassure ourselves, or not, because this is a complex interplay of different rules and settings. The light vehicles proposed standard didn't change the number, but the upper brake points for light vehicles and heavy vehicles did shift upward about 200 kilos. And then there's going to be other stuff that changes, like the central mass in running order number around which those curves are drawn is going to shift based on what the makeup of actual sales is. So it's like, I don't know. I wouldn't curl up and go to sleep and dream dreams of efficient cars, but I do think you're right, and this will drive substantial change. It's just needs a watchful eye on it.
I think as we got to when we were talking about the standards a couple of weeks ago, it really, it boils down to just how quickly EVs make up a bigger proportion of the fleet. Yeah. And then what that looks like in response to consumer choice, wants, alongside the traditional offerings, which are just not going to meet those standards, no matter how many things you might do to tweak those vehicles and improve their performance. Like by 2030, the makeup of cars that you'll see in car yards is going to look really different, and that's exciting.
And the thing I always come back to, in all these areas of emissions reduction policy, shifting the things that people buy when they're new is so much easier than trying to influence the usage or the early phase out of technologies once they've already bought them.
Yeah.
Right? Once the investment has been made, it's much, much tougher. So this is the point in the pipeline. This is actually the easy stuff to kind of shape the market for new appliances, new vehicles, new technologies. And that might come up once or twice in our discussion over the course of this episode, I reckon.
Chomping at the bit there. Maybe the only other thing we need to say is that we're not going to go too long before the whole thing is reviewed as well.
Yeah.
So we're looking at 2026 for a review, which I think, given everything you just said, Tennant, about the interplay of, a lot of different things averaging out to we're not exactly sure what, sounds like a good idea. So that looks like a pulse check in 2026. And I think the dreaded government IT project now needs to crack on is the other thing to say as well, to enable all of this to happen. So best of luck to our friends in the department that are going to be putting these registers together.
One of the changes that they announced was to defer crediting and debiting until 1 July next year rather than starting that bit of it on 1 January. And that was not a concession to industry. I think that was a concession to the poor people in the department who were otherwise going to have to stand up the most complex and fraught bit of it, because big dollars hinge on what's credited and what's debited and getting the mechanics right. Concession to reality. But it's going to take a little while to stand up a solid logistics there.
Shall we chat about a report?
Yep.
The Australian Energy Market Operator releases the Gas Statement of Opportunities, a document designed to assess whether gas reserves and infrastructure in central and eastern Australia are adequate to meet projected demand from households, businesses and gas-fired electricity generators over the next 20 years. The GSOO, as it is known, is designed to inform investments in both the development of new supply and the infrastructure needed to get gas to customers, with the goal of avoiding imbalances between supply and demand. However, over recent years, a whole host of issues have made the development of the GSOO an increasingly fraught exercise. These include dwindling gas supply in the southern states, the emergence of electrification as a highly uncertain variable in gas demand forecasts, and the contested role of hydrogen in Australia's energy mix. And of course, the entire premise of GSOO is itself contested, as there are plenty of stakeholders that reckon any additional investment in gas supply or infrastructure is antithetical to the achievement of a net zero economy. Tennant, GSOO 2024 is in some ways a dry document, but it is also one laden with import. What did you make of it?
So I'm a long-time customer of GSOO. I've been going through GSOOs for many years now. And, they exhibit a lot of continuity. They are dry documents. But, once you start focusing in on them every year, you start to get really excited about the little differences from one GSOO to the next. And so this one tells a story that in its broadest outlines is very familiar from the last few years, which is expected supply is coming down a lot faster than expected demand is. And so there is a crunch coming, and this year it builds up, but it reaches expected shortages of gas every year from 2028. And therefore, they say, something needs to be done, and they consider at the very highest level several kinds of something, basically all on the supply side, whether that's LNG import terminals or more gas storages or more gas production in the southern states or in the north, more transmission north to south in particular. But in the absence of some combination of those somethings being done, then there's a very big problem, which is that in a large number of days in winter especially, there wouldn't be enough gas to satisfy demand for gas-powered generation, industry and household and commercial heating. And the things that are really interestingly different about this from the last few years, a couple of GSOOs ago, the LNG import terminals were just assumed to happen, and there was no shortfall. It's just that the East Coast market was in the model getting more than half its gas from the United States or Qatar or WA, all equally exotic places, by the end of the 2020s. And people looked at that and said, is that going to happen? Does that make sense? And so the following year, they reclassified the LNG projects to uncertain rather than presumed. And suddenly there was a huge problem coming. And what are we going to do about it? And this year they're still uncertain, and a lot of the other potential solutions are uncertain. But also, there's been a lot more conversation about the demand for gas and emissions goals, and that stuff is sort of kind of weirdly reflected in GSOO, but not in a very active, let's take control of our destiny kind of way. More, for modelling purposes, we need to have a look at a few things that might happen on that front, but also not.
I think that because of who's on this podcast, we're going to inevitably go to town on the demand side part of this.
Yes.
But before we sort of segue into that, I think there's an important thing to say as well about the treatment of hydrogen in this GSOO as compared to the last one. Because in the last GSOO, they were including some fairly heroic assumptions about how quickly hydrogen would ramp up, and particularly steam methane reforming hydrogen production, and using and netting it off and making some claims around how much in net gas would be required to feed into the system. And they've moved that into a scenario, right? Probably because they got quite a lot of feedback about that. Not necessarily being the pathway forward. And importantly, in the hydrogen scenario, they've now completely removed SMR, and they're only contemplating green hydrogen created by electrolyzers from renewable electricity.
Yeah.
Right?
And more broadly with renewable gases, biogas as well, they're in there, but they regard, I think very fairly, what's currently firmly in train anywhere in Australia around green hydrogen and biogas as pretty titchy and not really moving the needle much in terms of overall gas substitution over the next 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And then anything beyond that is super uncertain. So they're open to it. If there's more policies that make more things happen, then hey, they'll update their models. But renewable gas is a very minor part of the scenarios they model at the moment.
And like on the supply side of this paper, when it's talking about the possibility of hydrogen or biomethane, I think it's an important reality check. Like, despite all of the conversation and the noise around the prospect of those two things, it doesn't really factor in meaningfully to their forecasts in terms of the amount they think it's going to be providing in the next little while. I think that's in sharp contrast to what I would say about the demand side of the equation here. But, for all the, at times, hearing proponents, and we've talked on this podcast previously around the context of Victoria with the gas substitution roadmap that biomethane can substitute for all household use, and like just sort of ambit claims like that being thrown around. There doesn't seem to be huge amounts of substance to that if you read this paper.
Well, I think we've crossed an important threshold in our journey around the debate around hydrogen here in Australia, when a Jan Rosenow meta-analysis stating that no independent academic study has backed in a role for low-temperature heat for hydrogen is referenced in a GSOO.
That is true.
That is true. But I do want to qualify the what we're saying here, because it is absolutely true that there's not a lot going on in the modelled scenarios, which have got names, the same names as the other, the scenarios that are being used by AEMO across the board.
Yep.
The step change, the progressive change, green energy exports. There's not a lot going on in hydrogen or biogas substitution for methane in those scenarios as of yet. But, and this is something we're going to spend, I think, most of our time talking about, those scenarios, as modelled, are not really in any way compatible with the emissions reduction goals that governments have got, or they're not solving it any which way. It's not just that they're not choosing hydrogen or biogas to solve.
So this is GSOO 2024 was my very first GSOO.
Congratulations.
and I went to unwrap it like an excited kid, would be unwrapping my first pony.
Really?
I was interested, because the reality of, the world that I inhabit sees a, declining role for gas, and that is broadly accepted in the stakeholder set that I deal with. So
you were expecting a pony. What did you find inside of the wrapping paper?
I don't know, some weird twilight zone where apparently the climate crisis isn't a thing that needs to be factored in here, and that we're talking about new supplying.
Oh no, there's a step change scenario, Frankie, which implies no step change whatsoever.
So, this is cognitive dissonance.
The step change is happening in the electricity sector, not the gas sector.
That's right.
I'm still not actually able to verbalise this properly, I think. But in the step change scenario in the GSOO paper, it still sees this quite large role for gas in lots of areas. It talks about the fact that electrification is now a thing, and that demand from households and small commercial is forecast to decline. but we're not talking about entirely. And then I think when you look at the other categories of use, like particularly in the industrial space, it pretty much just assumes a flat line out to the horizon of the period it's looking at, which is 20 years from here, which is most of the way to 2050.
Yes,
and that's just a bit unreal. And I wondered whether, this being my very first GSOO, whether historically it's just been a bit outside of the scope of the gas industry to reflect whether demand side action is necessary to consider when you're looking at supply shortfalls or the external drivers of climate policy. It was very bizarre.
I think you're totally right. The original purpose of GSOO is to signal where and when new supply side investment is needed to keep the show on the road. Very, very similar to ESOO for the electricity sector. And demand is something that you project and you try to understand. And they've done some work here. Like all the large industrial loads they've gone and interviewed or asked some questions of. Small industrial loads they've modelled, households. They've gone into some detail in trying to build state energy efficiency policies into their model. They've definitely, like other bits of AEMO, have done extremely detailed work on the electricity sector's future needs for gas peakers to back. So, they've done stuff. It's just all here's the input from that demand modelling to, okay, what's the things that we're actually advising on then needed? What actions are then needed to deal with that demand, rather than how do we shape that demand or actively transition that demand? It's like it's very clear in their modelling results, and they say it explicitly, that the amount of electrification that takes place across the scenarios makes a huge difference to whether and when there's a crunch between supply and demand. There's just this bizarre disconnect then to go, and therefore here's all the supply-oriented things that we need to do.
But just at that meta level of that inconsistency around, levels of gas demand they're assuming, and the net zero targets that are legislated in a couple of states, and indeed at the federal level, and there's sort of aspirational targets at different places around the country. I don't want to put all the blame at AEMO's feet, right? Because there is like a massive cognitive dissonance in the debate between the targets that governments are setting and the policy at a sectoral level. And they are very policy driven in this document.
Yes.
So what policies have governments got, and what should we assume based on the policies that are either being announced or actively publicly contemplated? And on the basis of those policies, the projections are relatively reasonable. Probably Victoria is the government that is doing the most to build some connective tissue between the big picture targets and the policy on the ground. But even Victoria, there are massive gaps in the story. At what rate are we electrifying homes? What are we doing about industrial gas use? What is the plan for decommissioning the network? There's no there for AEMO to really push up against. And so, in all of those areas, there are massive political conversations to grapple with. And so if AEMO got out ahead of that and started going, okay, you want to do net zero? This is what it looks like. Like, that would be a super interesting scenario that we would be all very excited by. Geez, it would set the hairs running.
Like, I agree with all of that. I don't think it's reasonable to ask the good folks at AEMO to model policy that doesn't exist yet necessarily. But I do think that the task of what this is trying to do could perhaps be reframed for, like, the multiple objectives that we're looking at over the next 10, 20 years, I don't think it would be anathema for AEMO to point out that, based on these modelled scenarios, this is the kind of then emissions profile associated with this part of the energy sector that remains. Hey, policymakers, you might need to think about more policies to do something about that. And I don't think then that the gas industry should be immune from having a conversation around demand-side policy as a solution to supply-side shortfalls. It's just that part of it is really, really bizarre to talk about the construction of import terminals and more pipelines north to south. A lot of this stuff that could be that would be stranded assets very quickly if, and I'm assuming when governments do get on with implementing the policies we need to be meeting those targets. It's just, I just found it very strange. I think GSOO could use an overhaul.
Well, so in a minute, let's talk about the sort of near to medium term versus the longer term around managing this. But to your point, Frankie, about the difference in framing or approach that AEMO could do here, it's worth thinking about what has happened to the integrated system plan over the last several years, because on the one hand, it would seem like the Australian energy market operator wouldn't want to set the hairs running in the way that Luke mentioned by coming out with this big, bold, here's what's got to happen and what you've got to do to make it happen. But they sort of did do that in electricity through that very strange process by which, ahead of governments actually really firmly adopting policies to require the early retirement of most of the coal fleet, AEMO's ISP was able to sort of launder stakeholder feel opinions to say, oh, it's just going to happen. And therefore we need to plan in our central scenario for these closures. And then that influenced governments to say, oh, well, because this is just going to happen anyway, we might as well have some policy to make it more orderly. And it just kind of manifested its way into existence that this is not driven by policy, but it is driven by policy, and electricity transformation is happening. And that hasn't quite been the way that the gas piece of things has played out yet.
I have been thinking about that over the weekend, because there is this discrepancy, right, between the way the ISP is involved and the way that GSOO is involved, because ISP has effectively opened up space for consensus building around a fairly bold renewable vision. That is definitively not happened in the GSOO. And I wonder whether the difference is that so much of the coal fleet was slated to retire over the next 10, 15 years anyway. And so we were already in the world of rebuilding, right?
But were we? Like those retirements, they've come forward a long way in the last 3 years.
But what I'm saying is it's not an existential threat for the entire electricity sector as it defines itself in the same way.
Well, they have redefined themselves. I think that is a big difference. That sector has stopped thinking of themselves largely as we are people who extract maximum value from a legacy fleet of coal plants that we own to we create value from providing energy services. Well, that might be a bit advanced, but electricity from whatever sources, and the new sources are cheaper. Gas people some of them have tried to reconceive themselves as suppliers of molecules, and they don't mind if those are natural gas or biomethane or hydrogen. But like that transition has not gone so very far as yet.
Well, is the graceful segue into molecule supplier as available to the gas industry as it was to the electricity industry, which is, I guess, the point that I'm making.
Yeah.
The economics are a lot less favourable.
Like, I did want to observe that when you look at, there's a lot of charts in this paper, by the way, people who
love it.
I understand, Tennant, why you've been a long time consumer of GSOOs based on the density of charts.
Inside the pony is a lot of charts.
It's like a chart pinata.
Whack it hard.
Oh, there's another one. Yeah. So a couple of interesting ones for me show like, you know, it's sort of, there's a little bit of the charts that are backward looking, and like it does show that like demand for gas, particularly the household and small, you know, like commercial level, have dropped like pretty significantly the last couple of years. One bit of their analysis that interested me was that, you know, they put a lot of that down to what was a very mild winter last year. As responsible for maybe the lion's share of the drop. A little bit less for gas power generation, and these early signs of increased electrification, but also consumer, like a demand response in reaction to high cost of living and what were much higher gas prices than people would have historically experienced. And the analysis around that was a little bit interesting as well, because I think in their modelling over time, and they even state that their modelling around consumption has been very inelastic in response to price changes. And I think that makes sense when you, to an extent, when you think about an industrial manufacturer who just needs the gas they need to manufacture the thing that they're doing, and there's not a lot that can be done to change that. But they do say, because the drop was so much over the last year, and there were, you know, all these different factors, they do want to unpack whether they need to adjust their thinking around consumer changes in demand in response to price signals as well. Because like we know, I mean, I think all of us have been part of conversations in our day job where you hear, like, particularly, at the end of the spectrum, where you talk about low income and vulnerable households, some of the things that get sacrificed along the way when things get really expensive is running your heater all the time when you would want to be. And like, that is a thing that happens. So I thought that was an interesting piece of the puzzle. Oh, then what didn't really connect with me in terms of the projections moving forward was like any consideration of that. And I think they're assuming maybe heroically that the price of gas is not going to be skyrocketing anymore, and that's now under control. But also just that this electrification happens at a reasonably slow pace over time. And I don't know if that sort of survives contact with reality, if we're thinking about the trends. Like, yes, if you're thinking about policies just announced, but I don't know. I feel like there's space for their scenarios to model more aggressive electrification based on the early policy announcements from, Victoria and the ACT, who are really leading the way. Like, there wasn't a huge amount of difference between 2023 and 2024 in the declines in household consumption. And like, in that intervening period, the gas substitution roadmap update in Victoria came out and paves the way for much more substantial change along those lines.
Yeah, you could absolutely do a scenario with, or maybe more than one, that was way more consistent in the long term with full transition of gas use. And that, depending on input assumptions, but very likely that modelling exercise would show a large amount of electrification of household and industry, and a decent amount of biogas and hydrogen in industry. And the results would be very vulnerable to different assumptions in what happens in the electricity piece of gas demand. And they haven't done that. They've got, as you said earlier, very stable industrial demand out for decades, and moved more by secret squirrel information they've got about closures of particular facilities in 15 years' time than anything else. They've got demand for gas for LNG exports declining from the mid-2030s, which is like a bit of a camel of a depiction of the balance of what the gas exporters have told them about how long their firm contracts run for, and then trying to vaguely reflect the direction of travel in IEA scenarios for world gas demand after that. But if we look at the next 5 years, I think that the difference that assumptions about rates of electrification and policy to support that and so on can plausibly make is much, much less than what it can do over 15 or 20 years. And so even while we throw a bunch of overripe tomatoes at the depiction of 2043 and what we need to be building with an eye to for that, I do think we need to take 2028 seriously as a challenge. And what should we do? And unpicking the peak demand forecasts is probably important too. But they are adamant at AEMO, new supply infrastructure is needed.
We didn't maybe probably step that out, but we've been talking a little bit around their assumptions, or the projections is that yes, gas use is declining in some uses, particularly at the household level, but it's declining. But it's not declining as fast as the gas supply from southern states, particularly out of Victoria. That's declining faster.
Bass Strait's making bubbling noises as the last dregs of gas are extracted.
Yeah, so there's going to be far less. I think it's almost halving the supply over the next 5 years, which is a huge change and adjustment. So the southern reserves are drying up, and then by the looks of it, some large projects that were expected to come online, over that period also look to be delayed. So you're seeing this situation where I guess you've still got your relative bonanza going on in the northern states, but most of that is being exported as LNG. And you're seeing the southern states where a lot more of the demand is, because gas demand, at least at the household level, is driven by heating requirements in winter. Potentially start seeing more structural shortfalls happen towards the end of the decade. So, yeah, that's what they're saying needs to be addressed through provision of new supply.
So there's an important distinction being made between shortfalls during extreme peak conditions and worst case scenario in the short term from AEMO's perspective is a really cold winter.
Yeah.
Not a lot of solar PV production. Everyone's blasting their gas heaters, but at the same time, there's more reliance on gas generation because there's less PV in the grid. So it's kind of like the perfect storm for gas demand.
Yep.
And in those extreme peak conditions, they regard 2025 as kind of a plausible period if all of those circumstances come together, that we could see shortfalls just on a daily basis, versus seasonal or annual shortfalls, which is kind of more of that structural imbalance between supply and demand that one would see over the course of a season or a year, which become much more plausible sort of 2028 onwards.
Yeah. And so if anybody takes a whack at this pinata and looks at the charts of peak day, individual day shortfalls, just bear in mind, as the text makes clear eventually, that they are looking exclusively for peak demand purposes at extreme weather condition years. Every year is a 1 in 20 year event in the peak demand analysis. Although it wasn't clear to me if like their temperature and weather numbers for 1 in 20-year events reflect
these are all
like the old climate.
They're all
exactly
historical.
right. That is what that was my question as well.
I mean, yeah, I would love to be corrected on that, but the way that those kind of things are chosen is based on historical data, which, like, again, like we had that whole conversation when we were talking adaptation the other day, looks a lot less fit for purpose when you're projecting not just 5 years into the future, but 20s.
I mean, we probably shouldn't be relying on sort of more mild winters driven by climate change to avoid shortfalls during extreme heat conditions.
Well, it's an alternative to supply side investment.
That's right.
Although, wait, it's not entirely independent of supply side investment.
It could be a relationship there, Tennant.
That's another report.
I was going to say, Tennant, did you want to take us through the supply side options that they are contemplating as plausible things we could pull the lever on in the next few years to avoid some of those structural shortfalls from 2028 onwards?
Yes. So AMO make the point that in the next couple of years, supply-side investments aren't going to make a difference either, that seasonal peak issues or peak day issues, really you've just got demand management and maybe running gas peakers off diesel as your short-term options.
And there is a new sort of gas-focused demand response mechanism in train to support that sort of activity.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The other things, though, that they are considering, so there is LNG import terminals, and there are 4 genuinely serious proposals for LNG import terminals in New South Wales, South Australia and Victoria. And they could be happening variously between 2026 and 2028. And they could make a big difference. AMO make the point that none of the solutions they're looking at could quote unquote solve everything on their own. And they are not assessing cost effectiveness of anything. It's just like how big are things. But so there's the LNG import terminals for whom the gas could come from anywhere. The pros of them are they're quite flexible. You can have a regas ship moor up for the Australian winter and then sail off to somewhere else for their winter. You can get more or less ships in to fill it if you need that. It is flexible. The other things are less flexible. They're more capital deployed, and they are increasing gas storages, and they think that more storages are just needed full stop to enable we're talking about peak issues as a significant part of this. You need that flexibility to, like, whatever your other solutions are. They're talking about more gas production in southern states or in the north. In the north, that could be just more CSG out of Queensland, and goodness knows there's an awful lot. But currently committed investments or even anticipated ones are not enough. So AMO says you need more, whether that's Queensland or Beetaloo or whatever else. Happy days. In the southern states, the new supply investment potential is I think it's largely Narrabri, and maybe a bit of extra Cooper gas. I don't think they expect much out of Victoria. And you've got pipelines. So there's a huge reliance on, in the baseline scenario, there's a huge reliance of southern states on getting more gas out of Queensland, and there's only so much that the current pipelines can carry. They can have more compression on them to carry more gas through the same existing pipelines. That's some CapEx. There's like investments in allowing backward flows or reverse flows on some existing pipelines. So it's a lot of stuff. It would take a decent amount of money. You would need to get going pretty quickly, and some of these things have kicked around for a long time. The LNG import terminals, which strike many people as insane, but they keep emerging in these models. They are not happening, not really because nobody's approving them. I mean, other than the AGL proposal in Victoria, which is not one of the four because that one is dead. They're not being knocked back for on approvals. The thing is, not enough people want to sign up to buy the gas, and we're in this bizarre situation where the market operators like pushing all the activate red light buttons they can and running a klaxon and saying, "In danger, Will Robinson." And meanwhile, people who want to sell gas can't find customers for the very understandable reason that after everything that's happened in international gas markets, who wants to be the one to sign up to pay what could be a very high price?
Yeah. So circling right back around to where we started the conversation, which is the compatibility of all of this with our net zero aspirations and some of the interim targets that we're contemplating. There is this tension, right? So you load all that up with the concerns that AEMO has around supply from 2028 onwards. However ambitious we get in terms of, the phasing out of the gas network, if that's the pathway we go down, there's going to still going to be a lot of customers on the gas network in 2028,
yes.
Right? So that needs to be managed. But by the same token, it seems 2024 seems like a fairly odd time to start investing in a whole lot of new gas infrastructure. So what do you do?
Yes. And particularly if you don't think that new gas infrastructure is ultimately going to be carrying a bunch of biogas or hydrogen because it's in the wrong places, or there's not going to be as much of those things used in 25 years' time as people talked themselves into thinking a couple of years ago, then sunk investment.
So this is where I think this strikes me as a very interesting year to be doing the exercise of constructing a whole bunch of sectoral decarbonisation plans.
What an amazing coincidence.
Because I would have thought that once we've got those sectoral decarbonisation plans, they should be the basis for a new scenario analysis, which is projecting demand consistent with a net zero by 2050 pathway in all the various sectors and what that would mean for the gas network. And of course, central to the energy and electricity sector plan is what's going on with gas and what is the interaction.
Yeah. And
in many cases, the handoff from the gas network to the electricity network. So one would hope, if not next year, but very possibly the year after, GSOO should look really, really different if it is reflecting that national policy around what we're all doing in all these various sectors, right?
Yeah, but does that factor in strongly enough for the late 2020s is maybe the comment there. I don't know. I've been listening to you both talk and I can't believe I'm about to say this, but then is one of the more sensible options to consider interventions that are going to require less capital outlays in what's going to be stranded infrastructure. Do LNG import terminals start to look...
Frankie Muscovich.
No.
Leading advocate for gas import terminals.
I object to that characterization. I'm just following a thought through to somewhat logical conclusion. I mean, I guess the alternative is austerity and telling people they can't have access to gas at certain times of year, which is a thing that has happened in much more severe circumstances.
LNG imports or jumper imports.
Regardless of, my speculative fiction about how in a perfect scenario sectoral decarbonisation pathways could sort of feed into sort of some unicorn GSOO in the future, the point is that it's really hard to assess any of these options unless you overlay, what we're ultimately aspiring to do in terms of net zero.
Yeah.
And specifically make some decisions about what the future trajectory of the gas network is.
Yes.
In the absence of that, you end up with what is effectively, represented in this GSOO, which is a steady state. There's a supply-demand gap. We build more supply, like we've always done. And we can't continue to do what we've always done is my point.
I mean, I think there's been so much focus in the national debate around the future of coal generation and, the consequence, I guess, of that for the electricity network. And, whilst I think there have been debates at least over the last 5, 7, 8 years around the future of the gas network from the usage sectors like industry, built environment, etc., and the suppliers of that infrastructure, it's not one that our policymakers or our public servants have leaned into heavily enough. This is actually the sort of thing that happens in an environment of policy uncertainty or wanting to kick that can a little bit further down the road. And then you find yourself at these crunch moments where absurdities like building LNG import terminals make sense as a short-term fix.
If you had to take a terminal and in this Faustian bargain, Frankie, you got all of the homes in Victoria upgraded with insulation, would you take it?
Of course I would. I mean, I come back to the first criticism I made of my new GSOO at the start of the episode, which is that I think we should be, as a part of this exercise, forced to consider demand-side policies as would be sensible to do in any other situation rather than contemplate spending enormous amounts of money in what could be stranded assets very quickly.
So they're looking at National Construction Code 2022, what the implications of that would be. They're looking at the decision by the Victorian government to not allow new gas connections in housing estates that require a planning permit. They are sort of considering the implications of, policies that are sort of in our immediate future, potentially like minimum rental standards in Victoria. But they're not contemplating any big new policies and what those implications would be. So if you insulated a couple of million homes over the next 15 years, what would that mean for supply-demand imbalance? And also what would that mean for the need for gas generation down the track in those peak demand periods when people are flicking on their reverse cycle air conditioner to heat up their home? These are very material to the task that we're taking on, particularly in Victoria, but there's no quantification of what the implications of that would be.
I wondered it. I did not read a reference to the Home Energy Upgrade Fund that was passed in the budget last year.
I think you're right. I don't think there was one.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to your point, Luke, if I was a policymaker in the hot seat able to do something with this GSOO, I'd be looking at insulating as many homes in Victoria and cold climates as possible over the next few years. And there is notionally a chunk of money available for that. I know that program hasn't been, stood up to its full potential yet. But I would have expected to see a reference to that. And I think that would be a perfectly reasonable response to the information in this paper, insulating more Victorian homes and making them draft proof and, all the energy efficiency things that are top of the list. should be no regrets measures. We should be doing it anyway. And I'd just be reading this GSOO as more of a reason to be getting on with it quickly.
There's one final issue that I would like to raise and then lower, because I think that some people will have been listening to all this and saying, but this whole problem is a fake problem. There's no shortage of gas.
Yep.
Eastern Australia produces vastly more gas than it consumes. It's just that it all goes to exports. So all you need to do is lean on those bloody exporters and there's no local problem. Job done. And all the rest of this is just marketing for the gas people to be able to do more gas stuff. I've read versions of that complaint. Like they're not wrong that most of the gas is exported. It's exported under long-term contracts. Breaking those contracts would be a very big deal. And the modelling from AEMO already assumes that uncontracted gas is sold to the domestic market whenever there's domestic demand for it. Yes, there are emergency export control powers that the government could bring in if there was could activate if there was a expected shortfall. And I think they will if it comes down to it, even to the extent of impacting contracted exports, but they don't want to have to do that, and they will pursue all alternatives to that because they would have massive calls for compensation. They'd have complaints from Japan and Korea.
Yep.
It would be a bad time.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's almost one of the easy criticisms or things to lob into these conversations, to try and just externalize the issue as something we don't have to worry about. And the reality is taking that kind of action does have consequences.
Is the piñata
shredded on the floor?
Shredded, charts lying everywhere.
Not a chart intact.
I think inside the piñata is another piñata, and inside that, again, it's piñatas all the way down. But I'm putting down my whacking stick.
I reluctantly will do the same.
Right, as always, we close up the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, I was going to riff on your one more thing from our last episode with just a minor update that the climate-related financial disclosures wagon is moving along, and a bill's been introduced to Parliament. And yeah, so there are a couple of changes around the nature of reports that need to be made by liable entities. I think one of the things that came through, and I know we had a whole conversation offline about Scope 3, which we didn't include in the pod last time, is that some of the more detailed elements of what companies would report is sort of being removed from the bill, and it's going to be dealt with the standards or the regs, if you like, that kind of report into it. So it's kind of a bit of a wait and see still on some of those issues. So they've, I guess, sort of delegated some of that detail to supporting standards, which are going to then go through their own process of finalisation. So all that said, it's just a bit of a mozza of climate-related stuff in Parliament at the moment. We touched on EVs up front. We know the fuel efficiency standards. We've got this. We've got stuff for the Net Zero Economy Authority. So yeah, there's a lot going on. And if you want to hear a little bit more about that, you should subscribe to our Patreon, because there might be just a little boko on some of that stuff coming your way. I'll leave it there.
Little bonus episode in your feeds, Patreons. And if you want to get onto that, patreon.com/let me sum up to hear what we reckon about all the stuff that's been going on in Parliament that we weren't able to cover in this very episode. Thanks, Frankie. Tennant, what have you got?
I have a very special announcement that our old friend William Nordhaus has a new paper out updating his beloved and authoritative DICE integrated assessment model so that it is less egregiously wrong than in the past in the kinds of outcomes and implications that it has. He's been working with presumably a new generation of graduates and research assistants, updating his model in all kinds of ways. It's still not a hugely satisfactory representation of the world.
So tell me, Tennant, what level of catastrophic climate change is now economically efficient?
Okay, so he doesn't emphasise this quite as much as in the past, but the cost-benefit optimal level of warming has fallen from above 3 degrees to a chilly 2.6 degrees.
Oh, there you go.
And the social cost of carbon is much higher in his model results than it used to be. In the cost optimal model, it's US $59 a tonne in 2025 and $89 a tonne in the 2 degrees path.
I think that means that Nordhaus is still closer to children of men than her in the patented LMSU model for catastrophic climate change.
The futurometer, that's right. And his there's a lot of stuff that's of interest in these 8 pages, but his model suggests that 1.5 degrees is completely infeasible. The model produces results that he regards as absurd when trying to achieve 1.5 degrees. You could dig into all of that a long way. I think it's just interesting that the sort of aging mediocrity model is moving in the direction of saying, oh yeah, this is a more urgent deal than once it might have seemed. I think findings beyond that may be treated loosely.
If relative newcomers, to let me sum up, are wondering why we're being so mean to eminent climate economist Bill Nordhaus.
Not as mean as some.
I direct you to episode 6, a picture of an apple and a mandarin shaped eraser critiquing integrated assessment models. I guess it's the beginning of this thread in the LMSU cinematic universe.
That's right.
In which we set up Bill Nordhaus as the Thanos of our mythological play.
And he's tremendously old. But I think, like a good comic book character, William Nordhaus will never truly die.
All right. I've got a slightly parochial one more thing today. Firstly, I want to note that my friend Holly Taylor, who was head of strategy and partnerships at the Energy Efficiency Council, hung up her spurs a couple of weeks ago after 6 blockbuster years at the EEC. Holly, anyone who knows her will be more than aware, is an absolute powerhouse, and she spearheaded a number of initiatives while she was at the EEC, including creation of the EEC Professional Certifications Framework and the Net Zero Jobs campaign, which was made such a splash in the second half of last year, which EEC runs in partnership with our friends at the CEC. So we are all very sad, but she was ready for the next challenge. And if you get to work with someone of Holly's calibre for 6 years, I reckon you're doing pretty well. But what that means is that we're in the market for a new head of partnerships, and we're looking for someone to work closely with me around engagement with current and prospective members, our key partners in the not-for-profit space, and also funders for our pipeline of strategic projects. I think probably the best way to describe it is BD with a bit of purpose. And as I think Holly would attest, if that is your jam, it can be a lot of fun and very fulfilling. So we have an ad up right now. We'll put it in the show notes. But if you are in any way interested in any of that, you can respond to that ad or hit me up on LinkedIn. I would be more than happy to have a chat?
I'm totally here for the Holly Love Fest. We're going to miss you from EEC land, Holly, but we know you'll, after you have a well-deserved rest, you'll land somewhere in our orbit. I'm totally here for the taking over the pod to use as your recruitment platform. Didn't see that one coming. But, I mean, you know, what better potential audience for that than our community of summer uppers?
Yes, it is slightly cheeky, but, you know, like filling the shoes of someone as fantastic as Holly requires a multi-channel approach. Frankie.
He does. He needs all the help he can get, guys. Come on.
I join the salute to Holly, and I will also say, having seen Luke's job interview approach recently when he was trying to recruit tavern staff in Dungeons and Dragons. Just if you're applying for this, make sure you don't have a secret tragic backstory that would make you wildly inappropriate and a source of far too many dangerous adventures.
I'm sure that has not muddied the waters at all.
That's going to be edited out, don't worry.
That is our show for today. If you have reports you wish us to review or comments on this very episode, please send them in to mailbag@letmesumup.net. We also have a website. Frankie, do you want to tell us about our website? What's there?
Oh, well, it's a veritable smorgasbord of Let Me Sum Up classics with the best titles you could hope for. It's probably not an overstatement to say that we at least half record this podcast so we get to name them. And so you can go to letmesumup.net and find every episode we've ever recorded with snazzy titles to boot.
And Tennant, if our listeners' ears have pricked up and they're wondering, you know, what are all these amazing alternative titles that didn't make the cut? What should they do? How could they possibly access all that extra content?
They should not think, not get distracted. They should act now, go now, be in the now at our Patreon at patreon.com/letmesumup. And so much bonus content. More all the time, certainly including a lot of titles that, like, you might think are even better than the ones that we finally went with. Who can say?
Yes, indeed. That is our show for Frankie Muskovich and Tennant Reid. I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.